Hello, I'm Nadine Groskowiak, the Gluten Free RN. Today, during episode 67 of the Gluten Free RN podcast, I am going to talk about the indigenous populations of the world and celiac disease, and find out what's happening in 2018 regarding indigenous populations and celiac disease. Stay tuned. Have you ever wondered if celiac disease is just a disease for white people or people of Northern European descent? Well, hopefully by now, after episode 66, you realize that celiac disease is a worldwide epidemic, and enormously undiagnosed or underdiagnosed in virtually every population of the world, and especially in indigenous populations all over the world. And interestingly enough, if it's not factored into the prevalence and incidence reports, then those numbers need to be revised as soon as we can get a worldwide mass screening of celiac disease proper, taking into account that prevalence and incidence will change as we diagnose more people. And of course, as I've mentioned over and over during the Gluten Free RN podcast, you can be ruled in for celiac disease, but you can't, at this time in history, actually be ruled out for celiac disease and or non-celiac gluten sensitivity. We just don't have tests that are 100% accurate at this point, and many people get missed. So while you can be ruled in for celiac disease proper, you may not be ruled out at this point. And until people are factored in, those prevalence and incidence numbers will be low. What we know about the indigenous populations of any continent is they tend to be hunter-gatherers, or in their history had been hunter-gatherers. And according to the World Health Organization, there are an estimated 370 million indigenous peoples living in more than 70 countries worldwide. They represent a rich diversity of cultures, religions, traditions, languages, and histories, yet continue to be among the world's most marginalized population groups. The health status of indigenous peoples varies significantly from that of non-indigenous population groups in countries all over the world. And we also know that indigenous population groups, depending on where they are and what they're influenced by, tend to have greater health issues than, as noted, non-indigenous peoples. And what are some of those health issues? Some of those health issues, especially for the Native Americans or the First Peoples of Canada, the Maoris of New Zealand, what has been noted is that they have a higher incidence of things like type 1 diabetes, autoimmune diseases, addictive disorders, obesity, heart attacks and strokes, issues related to fetal development and maternal health, and a lower life expectancy pretty much across the board. Why do Native peoples or indigenous populations tend to have worse health outcomes than perhaps the rest of the population? Is it access to healthcare? Is it lifestyle choices? Is it isolation? It could be all of those things, but please take into account that it has a lot to do with the food people are exposed to or eating. For the vast majority of these populations, they were hunter-gatherers until the colonial people, the Europeans or the invaders or the world conquerors took over and brought their foodstuffs with them and started to propagate it. If you're interested in reading a really great book, I highly recommend Guns, Germs, and Steel: The Fates of Human Societies, written by Jared Diamond. I've read it a couple times, and it really does give a great overview of how some civilizations developed and spread and others did not. Most of it had to do with natural resources, such as food and access to protein and good fats, and the development of agriculture. So Guns, Germs, and Steel would be a great book to read if you're interested in finding out about the history of civilizations and why some developed and why some remained hunter-gatherers. So I've been interested in the Native populations for a number of years, and when I started the Gluten Free RN, one of the first questions I asked is why Native Americans were not tested for celiac disease because way back in 2008, I was unable to find any studies done on the Native American populations related to celiac disease. If you've read my book, Donation, A Nurse's Memoir of Celiac Disease from Missed Diagnosis to Food and Health Activism, you will already know that I have actually been asking these questions right along. And I'm going to read just one paragraph out of my book. It's from page 86, and it goes like this. The American continents, and therefore the native peoples on both of these continents, North and South America, from the top to the bottom, were not exposed to grains until less than 500 years ago, when these continents were invaded by Europeans, including Christopher Columbus, who brought not only smallpox, but also grains. Grains were not indigenous to these continents. There was no wheat, barley, rye, or oats in the Americas. If the native people grew anything, depending on where they lived, it was corn, squash, and tubers. And even if there were grains, the native peoples had more than enough food to eat and did not need to grow a labor-intensive crop that was poorly digested, even by the Mesopotamians, who knew that without soaking and fermenting those grains, they would make people sick. The soaking and fermenting of the grains causes long-chain amino acids to be broken down into smaller amino acids, making the proteins potentially less toxic. I love when people say that we have been eating grains for 10,000 years. So those grains have to be good for us, right? Unless your people come from the area of the Fertile Crescent, your people have not been eating grains for 10,000 years. I gave a talk to some of the local Native American tribal members a few years back. I was enormously excited to finally have an inroad into the Native population. If there was one group for which I had been enthusiastically voicing my desire for a mass screening for celiac disease, it was this population. Way back in 2008, I wrote a blog post that specifically asked, why isn't there one study in the whole country on the incidence of celiac disease in the Native American population? When I do a Google search to see if there are any current studies available on this topic, my blog post is still the #1 result. A PubMed search for Native Americans' celiac disease show no related research articles either. None. And this is in 2018. And I do understand that there are legal issues regarding testing Native populations for genetic studies. I understand that. This would be potentially one of those areas where it might be a good idea to revisit that legal issue and consider having the Native populations actually conduct these tests themselves. It would be great if the Indian or the Native American health services would actually do a screening for celiac disease proper on all of their populations, especially since many of the Native American populations and the indigenous populations worldwide have a significant risk for developing type 1 diabetes, autoimmune issues, addictive disorders, suffer from obesity, increased morbidity and mortality, and have issues with fetal development, maternal health, cardiovascular disorders, strokes, heart attacks. There's many health issues that can be traced back to the fact that perhaps the food that these people are eating is causing them to be ill. Given the fact that the vast majority of the indigenous populations were hunter-gatherers, and then once an indigenous population is forced to eat the food of the conquerors, we notice a significant change in healthcare outcomes and quality of life. Another fact to keep in mind that if every person with type 1 diabetes is a gene carrier for HLA-DQ2 and or DQ8, that would be a great place to start for testing for celiac disease in the Native population. Because basically we have the hunter-gatherer foods of the local area, so all tribes, all different groups of indigenous populations typically and traditionally had eaten whatever was available to them locally, whether it was fish or wild game, tubers. Some populations actually had agriculture and they grew corn or squash or beans. But then if you add in the fact that these people were then exposed to grains very quickly, shortly after Christopher Columbus and his cohorts actually landed on the Americas, they brought those grains with them. They brought wheat, barley, rye, oats, They brought those grains with them and then exposed the Native American populations to those grains. And then we start to see generation after generation of people getting sicker if they're not diagnosed with celiac disease and placed on some variation of a gluten-free or a paleo-type diet, a whole food diet. Every generation gets sicker. That really does need to be taken into account. And we know that there's 370 million indigenous peoples across 70 countries per the World Health Organization. But what is the prevalence and incidence of celiac disease in those populations? It's at least 1%, if not 3%, which is currently estimated, and perhaps higher. And because it hasn't been factored into prevalence and incidence reports, then we really don't know what the prevalence and incidence of celiac disease is yet. My professional opinion is the numbers will be much higher. And they'll be much higher because the prevalence and incidence of celiac disease in these populations will be higher. Unfortunately, at least in the United States, there are issues with food scarcity, food deserts, and food insecurity for the Native populations. When I did give a talk, one of the lovely people said, I'd love to eat better, but I live in poverty and I have to rely on the commodity foods that are given to me by the government. And it's interesting to note what the commodity foods are. And this comes directly from the USDA website. And I've included this as a resource on the podcast notes. This is from the Commodities Supplemental Food Program, specifically for seniors, but I am aware that the Native populations have access to the same type of packages or the same type of food. So a sample, and this is figure 1 on that handout, would be cereal dry, juice, tuna fish, evaporated milk, instant non-fat milk, peanut butter, macaroni, processed American cheese, fruits, fruit juice, and vegetables. The fruits, fruit juice, and vegetables are in cans, so they're not fresh. They are processed. So the vast majority of the food that people are getting as a part of this commodity package is highly processed food that is not in any way, shape, or form similar to the food they ate as hunter-gatherers. I also included in the podcast notes a really interesting article by the Prairie Nymph, Enjoying Metamorphosis, Canada's Food Guide and Native Women. And I did email her and let her know that I actually enjoyed her article enormously and would be interested to hear if she has done any further work or made any further inroads on educating people. The topic of this article is the Canadian Food Guide for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, helping or harming First Nations women. And I find this 3 paragraphs specifically interesting. At least the food guide mentioned lactose intolerance and gave an alternative source. It did not mention celiac or wheat intolerance at all. According to a presentation by Dr. Green of Columbia University, rates of celiac disease are rising. In North America, celiac disease affects approximately 1%. Celiac disease leads to higher risk of anemia, osteoporosis, cancer, depression, mental fog, and difficulty in maintaining healthy weight. A study of 4,633 people in Germany found that women who had undiagnosed celiac disease have mortality rates from cancer 2.7 times higher than men, and overall mortality was 2.1 times higher. There are several risk factors for celiac that are much higher for First Nations people. Lactose intolerance has been linked with undiagnosed celiac disease, and the Canadian Digestive Health Foundation states that 25% of patients who have been clinically identified as lactose intolerant have celiac disease. Gastrointestinal infections are also a risk factor in developing celiac disease, and First Nations people have an H. pylori rate of 75%, the highest in the country. Aboriginal women have less access to medical care and less chance of diagnosis, and therefore a higher probability of living with undiagnosed celiac disease. While I could not find specific numbers for rates of celiac in Aboriginal women, several First Nations women I have talked to mentioned specific bowel pain when eating breads and the relief they found when going off wheat. We still do not have the data to understand how this impacts the health of Aboriginal women, but when the studies do come, I predict they will not be favorable. All of the grains except for the one picture of rice in the food guide are wheat-based. Canada's Food Guide has an opportunity to bring the latest scientific knowledge to the average First Nations woman. They have not done so. Instead, they have red-washed a guide based on European origin diets. Despite findings that many First Nations and Inuit people may have adverse health impacts from the diet they promote, despite studies showing health benefits for First Nations people who follow a more traditional diet, they only change the graphics. This action shows an unconscious disregard for the struggles of Native women across the country. Those women who are most vulnerable to poverty, abuse, and discrimination should not have to endure yet more attacks on their health. I wish for Canada's Food Guide to apologize to the First Nations women. I wish for them to acknowledge the wisdom of their traditional diet without co-opting certain foods from it and tacking them into something harmful. If diet can be addressed, many of the diseases and conditions that First Nations women face can be reversed. It is time that food become once more a source of life and empowerment instead of another form of violence. Those are powerful words. And like I said, I did in fact include this article in the podcast notes. Please feel free to read that over and use it, especially if you have any access to Native people's health care and any studies that can be done regarding Native people's or Aboriginal people's or Indigenous people's health care. It would be great if we could band together and confront this as an empowered group. I, of course, would offer anything I can do myself to any Native group or Aboriginal group or Indigenous peoples to come in and actually educate people about what real food is. So I know that many Native groups consider flatbread to be a Native or a traditional Indian or a traditional Native food. Trust me, it's not. It's made with wheat. It couldn't be. Native people did not eat flatbread before the Europeans landed on North America's shores. It just didn't happen. There was no flatbread. There was no fry bread. Fry bread is basically a nutrient-deficient, cheap filler food that people get addicted to. Also, grain alcohol. It really does have to be thrown in there that grain alcohol and beer are all grain-based. And it needs to be acknowledged that the Native populations tend to have a higher rate of alcoholism or drug abuse or addiction issues. I will continue to call for a mass screening for celiac disease worldwide. And I will very pointedly call for a mass screening of all Indigenous populations for celiac disease and non-celiac gluten sensitivity. It would be great if health services for all Native Americans or First Nations or the Maori or any other Aboriginal tribe would test for celiac disease very pointedly or do an education program about what was Indigenous food for that population. I'm also going to give you a resource for a cookbook. It's called The Sioux Chef Indigenous Kitchen. The Sioux Chefs is SIOUX, so it's the Sioux Tribe Chefs Indigenous Kitchen Cookbook by Sean Sherman with Betty Dooley. So it really is a fabulous cookbook, and I'm going to read the inside cover. Here is real food, Indigenous American fruits and vegetables, wild and foraged grains, game and fish. I highly recommend people look at the Sioux Chef's Indigenous Kitchen Cookbook by Sean Sherman. It will give you an idea of what Native food looks like, at least for this particular area of the United States. And on the inside cover of the book, it states, Sherman dispels outdated notions of Native American fare, no fry bread or Indian tacos here, and uses no European staples such as wheat flour, dairy products, sugar, and domestic pork or beef. The Sioux Chef's healthy plates embrace venison and rabbit, river and lake trout, duck, quail, wild turkey, blueberries, sage, sumac, timsula or wild turnip, plums, purslane, and abundant wildflowers. Contemporary and authentic, his recipes include cedar braised bison, griddled wild rice cakes, amaranth crackers with smoked white bean paste, Three Sisters salad, deviled duck eggs, smoked turkey soup, roasted corn sorbet, and hazelnut maple bites. That all sounds great, and Honestly, if I have a chance to eat some of this food at some point, whether I cook it myself or end up at any restaurant where I can find this food, I am going to go and eat it and enjoy it. It really does sound quite tasty, and my mouth is watering just thinking about it. So there are a lot of resources, and I did post a lot of resources, what I could find on the podcast notes. I encourage you to do more research. I encourage you to share with me anything that you find. And if you're in a position of power for a health clinic that provides healthcare to Native populations, please contact me if you need help doing a study or if you want to put together some guidelines for a study. I'd love to be involved or at least help make that come to fruition. As you all know, I go to most of the conferences, and several years ago at one of those conferences, one of the prominent celiac disease doctors laughed when I specifically called for a mass screening for all indigenous populations. He suggested that there was no celiac disease in the Native population, so why would I as a nurse call for a mass screening of any indigenous populations? How ludicrous. Well, the reality is that if we don't study it, we really have no idea what the prevalence or incidence for the indigenous populations are. So we do need to do those studies. They cannot just be put aside. These people are suffering health-wise. They have increased morbidity and mortality at every age. Fetal development and maternal health is impacted, and every generation gets sicker. It is vitally important that we deal with these issues for society's benefit overall and also for these people's healthcare outcomes. We really do need to deal with the fact that food is medicine, and until we stop feeding people highly processed food that they're not meant to eat, none of us are meant to eat highly processed foods that are high in grains or dairy. So until we actually deal with the fact that food is medicine and it has a huge impact on healthcare outcomes, we need to make that connection, and we need to make it sooner than later, and we need to do these studies. So have these conversations with anybody that you think may have an impact on getting these studies to be done, or at least giving talks in indigenous population groups so that they know that they are at risk and they actually can be empowered to change their diets and potentially get better. Not just for this generation, but for many generations in the future. There is a huge difference between indigenous foods versus commodity foods or the foods that the governments provide to people. So we need to be very aware of that. We need to be very aware that food is medicine and it potentially has a huge negative impact on health if the foods that people are eating are not nutritious or cause celiac disease in a high-risk group, or foods that are nutrient deficient. All of those things need to be addressed. This has been a great episode, and I know that we could actually break this down for every indigenous population of every continent, and very specifically go down the rabbit hole for every indigenous population. I tried to keep it broad, to keep it worldwide. You can look into indigenous populations wherever you live, whether it's in Canada or the United States, in New Zealand, Australia, South America, anywhere. So do your research. And if you have an opportunity to do one of these research studies or to do a mass screening for even a limited population of Native people or indigenous populations or Aboriginals, please take that opportunity. Thank you very much for joining me, Nadine Griskoyak, the Gluten Free RN, for episode 67 on indigenous populations and celiac disease, including non-celiac gluten sensitivity. This is an opportunity to impact the health, the quality of life, and the healthcare outcomes for at least 370 million people worldwide across 70 countries that make up the indigenous populations. We need to get started. We really do need to make some inroads and do these studies. The next time I do a Google search on indigenous populations and celiac disease, I hope there will be many studies to refer to and to cite for another episode of the Gluten Free RN podcast in the future. Thank you very much for joining me, Nadine Griskoyak, the Gluten Free RN, for episode 67. Thanks to all listeners that have been listening right along since the beginning, and welcome to all new listeners. If you have an opportunity, please leave a review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Player, or wherever you listen to the Gluten Free RN podcast. Thanks again for joining me. Do your research. Let me know how I can help. And until next time, this is the Gluten Free RN, Nadine Griskowiak, signing off. Bye.